Hello, welcome to Endemic Times. My name is Amira. This video is a continuation of the global food crisis that I am looking into. This video specifically is going to be looking at the global impact of the war in Ukraine and how that is impacting everyone globally, from both a food supply issue to also just a cost of living crisis that we are seeing pretty much every global economy. The information here comes from a UN report that I'm going to link in the description box below so that if you would like to take a deeper look at it, you can. There is a very serious global food crisis that is ongoing, and it's looking like it's only going to get worse. Because of the pandemic and global supply chain issues, there was already a bit of food shortages and lower availability, especially to developing nations that are in serious need. And the war in Ukraine, unfortunately, is really going to cost a lot of money, a lot of lives, and even more tension and tenuous situations going on between our global nations. There are an estimated 1.6 billion people in 94 countries that are exposed to at least one dimension of the crisis, and 1.2 billion of them live in perfect storm countries, which are severely vulnerable to all three dimensions: food, energy, and finance of the cost of living crisis. Vulnerable people in vulnerable countries are already being hit hard, but make no mistake, no country or community will be left untouched by this cost of living crisis. Incomes are being squeezed, and families are forced to decide how to allocate shrinking household finances. And so, with this in mind, another vicious cycle starts: the cycle of social unrest leading to political instability as a result of the weakened ability of countries and families to cope with yet another global crisis on top of COVID-19 and the climate crisis. About 60% of the world's workforce is estimated to have lower incomes than before the pandemic. More than half of the world's poorest countries are in debt distress or at high risk of it. The World Food Program estimates show that the number of severely food insecure people doubled from 135 million pre-pandemic to 276 million over just 2 years. The ripple effects of the war in Ukraine, however, are expected to drive this number up to 323 million in 2022. This year's food crisis is about lack of access. Next year's could be about lack of food. Ukraine's food production and the food and fertilizer produced by Russia must be brought back into the world markets despite the war. And we'll see this moving forward. There is a serious issue when it comes to not just the food supply itself, but the ability to have more food available in the upcoming years. There is a really serious issue when it comes to fertilizer. And with a lack of fertilizer or a lack of availability of it, prices are starting to increase, which is pricing out a lot of farmers, which will then reduce their ability to have as many crops, which then leads to less yield, which then leads to a lessened food globally in the supply, and that is a serious issue. Countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, remain significantly vulnerable, with 1 out of every 2 Africans in the region exposed to all three dimensions of the crisis. The Latin America and the Caribbean region is the second largest group facing the cost of living crisis, with nearly 20 countries deeply affected. Extreme poverty could threaten the lives and livelihoods of 2.8 million people in the Middle East and North Africa. In South Asia, which is currently experiencing crippling levels of heat waves, 500 million people are severely exposed to the food and finance crisis. Countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia are severely exposed to the energy and finance dimensions. One of the things discussed in this report is the price shocks that so many people are starting to experience. And this is just a few of those key points in this report that they detail. The FAO Food Price Index is at near record levels and 20.8% higher than this time last year. Crude oil has now reached over $120 per barrel, and energy prices overall are expected to rise by 50% in 2022. European natural gas has risen tenfold. Fertilizer prices are more than double the 2000 to 2020 average. Maritime transport costs are more than triple. Rising interest rates and growing investor uncertainty has eroded both the value of developing countries' currencies as well as their capacity to borrow in foreign markets. And this continues. After the first 100 days of the war, the currencies of 142 developing countries have depreciated on average by 2.8% against the US dollar. Higher energy prices, especially diesel and natural gas, increase the costs of fertilizers and transport. Both factors increase the costs of food production. This leads to reduced farm yields and to even higher food prices next season. This is basically a really bad ripple effect. With the pandemic, we already had a supply crisis. Now we're having a food crisis in addition to a continuing pandemic with even more issues of transportation because oil is going up. Here in the United States, people are really already starting to feel the pinch because we are seeing the very likelihood that we are currently in a recession. Inflation is absolutely insane, and the cost of everything is going up while wages are not increasing at all. And any wage gains that people made during the pandemic have been pretty much nullified by where the market is right now. So this war in Ukraine, this proxy war that the United States has done, is really causing not just issues here at home, but globally. That's where it becomes a question of, do we continue to move forward, or do we try to look for some alternative ways to help to alleviate this issue? And that really does come from lifting sanctions and also working to bring peace talks to Ukraine and Russia and quell tensions. That's really what's necessary right now, because this isn't just about Ukraine and Russia and the United States. This is about the global community as a whole. And wars affect everyone, and it always affects the people at the bottom so much more than those at the top. Since 2019, the number of people living in extreme poverty has risen by 77 million, and the number of people facing acute food insecurity has risen to 193 million. Worldwide, 3 out of 5 workers, mostly in developing countries, have lower real incomes than before the pandemic. And that is a really big issue, again, because the cost of everything is going up. If your wages are not able to keep up with that, it's going to make you more poor. It's going to make your situation much more difficult to just generally deal with. And that's going to have a precipitating effect when it comes to your physical health, your mental health, and a host of other issues. In Africa, 58 million people living just above the poverty line are at risk of sliding into poverty due to the combined effects of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. Nearly 90 million people in Asia and Africa who previously gained access to electricity can no longer afford to pay for their basic energy needs. More than 20 million people are forcibly displaced each year due to climate change effects. There is so much instability in so many of these nations, and it's not because of one particular thing. It's been a systemic issue, ripple effects from one war to another war that causes instability, that causes the inability to get supplies and resources to these countries. And sadly, as we're seeing here, people that finally got electricity now can no longer afford to have it. This has precipitating effects that are just going to make the tensions in these areas much worse, and the ability to come to the table, finding ways to meet in the middle, mediating peace talks, all of those things, because it turns into survival mode. And when you're in survival mode, you can't always make the best decisions for yourself. And unfortunately, with this ongoing war, it's going to create more people having to experience that, and it's just going to continue to have major negative effects. Globally, between 2019 and 2021, 30 million people lost access to clean cooking fuel, and the global figure now stands at 2.4 billion who lack access. In 2020, 50 million people in sub-Saharan Africa who recently gained Tier 1 electricity were no longer able to afford it and slipped back into energy poverty. About 568 million people in sub-Saharan Africa lacked access to electricity in 2020. Just as a little side tangent, it just seems so crazy to me that in 2022 we have so much technology around us. We've had so many advances in what we can do. The fact that we still have so many people in poverty, so many people going hungry, just really shows the effects of our system and what we could be doing versus what we are doing, and how much trauma and cruelty that's being inflicted on people because they aren't in a certain income bracket. to be able to afford certain things when there are basic necessities that everyone should have available to them. In 2022, with all of this technology, it just seems wrong that this many people are going hungry, that this many people are starving and dying, that this many people do not have access to something that a lot of us might take for granted, which is the energy all around us. So this is a great depiction of what kind of cycle this creates when you have food prices that are increasing and how everything is related to each other. So by having prices increasing in foodalizer, it's going to increase the cost of food. By oil being at record levels of $120 per barrel, that's going to make the price of everything that much more expensive. And then you can look at natural gas being 10 times higher than 2020 levels in Europe. And maritime trade costs are nearly 3 times the pre-pandemic level, and interest rates are rising everywhere. And these cycles will trigger social and political unrest. An increase in cost of living, lower incomes, your ability to cope goes down, your living standards go down, countries are not able to be fiscally responsible to their citizens and able to cope with the seriousness of these several issues that are happening. And then that creates an issue of social protection and safety nets that may or may not be available to people. This causes so many issues. And it makes it so difficult to bring people to the table, to have peace talks, to have mediation, because everyone is feeling like they're being hit the hardest. And in reality, everyone is being hit very, very hard. But in particular, these developing countries that have been completely decimated by decades of war, decades of countries coming in and trying to put their stamp on the people and have control of those nations, whether it's doing a coup and establishing a new leader. These are all part of the reasons of why these areas are going to continue to be in such unrest, because we kind of just can't leave them alone to figure out the things that they need to figure out and give them the support where they need it. We always have to have some ulterior motive when we go into these countries, especially the United States. But the United States is not alone. These are all of the developed nations, all of the first world nations love to go into these countries and insert their beliefs, insert these leaders that they think are better, but really they're just puppets to these different countries' establishments. We need to give countries the space and the time that they need to grow, to build their infrastructure, and we need to find a way to find a better balance between people's needs and the global economy as a whole. This is looking at just overall food prices and incomes at home. As food prices rise, incomes at home fall, and the estimated impacts of corn and wheat price inflation on real household incomes in these various countries can be shown here. And according to the World Bank, taking into account only the price increases for corn and wheat, the average household has lost 1.5% in real income since the start of the war. The World Bank suggests that the war in Ukraine may bring up to 95 million people into extreme poverty, making 2022 the second worst year ever for poverty alleviation, behind only 2020. The ILO estimates that all of the partial recovery in paid hours of work witnessed globally in 2021 may be erased by the second quarter of 2022. In 2022, between 179 and 181 million people are expected to face crisis or worse conditions in 41 out of the 53 countries where data is monitored by the global network. So these are further food security issues that are being caused by the war in Ukraine. This is a really big issue, that the number of several food insecure people doubled from 135 million pre-pandemic to 276 million at the start of 2022. The ripple effects of the war in Ukraine are expected to drive this number up to 323 million in 2022. 36 million people are forecasted to face emergency conditions or worse in 36 countries in 2022. Chronically undernourished people are expected to increase in 2022. One of the really mind-blowing things that was listed in this UN report is that a moderate shock scenario would increase undernourished people by 7.6 million in 2022, but a severe shock scenario, so this is something where we have like a trifecta of issues happening, that would increase undernourished people by 13.1 million. These are really huge increases for what they do see as estimates in the lower side of how this global food crisis, because of the war, is going to affect people's ability to take care of themselves. These are very, very high numbers of people that are going to be food insecure and undernourished. With the war in Ukraine, and if there is no increase in the global availability of food, the expected number of undernourished people will increase by close to 19 million in 2023. The livelihoods of more than 2 billion small producers, farm laborers, rural workers, and their families are at risk, not least because they already cannot afford a healthy diet. So, as discussed near the beginning of this video, what will make this crisis even worse, last for longer, and have even worse consequences? That is the rising cost of fertilizers. 1 out of every 2 people worldwide depend on agricultural products that use fertilizers. So, with less fertilizer, it results in lower yields and an overall decrease in food availability, production in the coming seasons. And that's what we see here. The rise in the price of fertilizers is outpacing the rise in the price of food. Fertilizers are fast becoming unaffordable for farmers. This looks at rising fertilizer prices disproportionately hurting farmers in developing countries. In Northern America, herbicides, labor, and fertilizers are lower. The output price for North America is 450 versus West Africa, which is 335. But you can see here that the profits for North America are 61% versus 22% for West Africa. Really does show the systemic effects when it comes to the cost of fertilizer and, unfortunately, these small farmers being priced out, which means they can't grow as much as they used to, if at all, and that's going to have a really bad effect as things move forward. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this information was helpful. If you'd like to check out the report, I'm going to have it down in the description box below. Please like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell. If you'd like to check out more videos on this series, you can check out my playlist right here. Stay safe, take care, and remember to be kind to each other.